Now that we have a rough idea of what we're going to be, or the way that we're going to be structuring our database layer, let's now begin by writing a test. So the first test we want to write regarding our database will be a connection test. So let's call this database connection test. So remember, the name should end with test. And this class needs to extend test case. So you always ensure that you're importing the use statement. And right here, we want to test that we can actually connect to the database. So we can say public function test. It can connect to database with PDO API. So we're going to start with PDO, and then we're also going to have one more test for MySQLi API. So the idea is to use our test as a kind of guide to build the application so that we can imagine what do we actually want to do when we want to connect to the database. We write a kind of test for that, and then this test is going to fail, obviously, because we don't have all of the things set up. And then we can now begin to create the classes, create the interfaces to ensure that this test pass. And once we are done with that, we are rest assured that our application actually works the way that it should work. So we want to begin with PDO. And obviously, PDO is not going to be the first class that we want to create. Okay, so we want to first of all create an interface and then also create an abstract class. If we go back to the diagram that we saw previously, we have a database connection interface and also we have the abstract connection. So we want to have these two in place before we actually create our PDO connection class. All right, so let's see. Right here, we want to assert that we can actually get a connection. So let's start by saying assert not null. And then we're going to create a new instance of a PDO class. Okay, so we're going to, oh, we can actually do that here. So we're going to say PDO handler is going to be equal to new PDO connection. Okay, so just think with me. Imagine with me, we don't have this class yet, but we're going to actually create this class. So new PDO connection, and then we're going to pass in some kind of credentials that are required to make this connection. And then we want to chain on to the connect method. So this is the way that we would like to actually connect. So we want to say connect. Okay, so we don't have any of this in place and the code is actually not properly written. So going to fix that quickly. So this is what we want on a good day. So when I want to connect to a database, I would just say new PDO connection, for example, pass in the credentials and then call a connect method. And then from here, the PDO handler, I could actually get the connection. Okay, so we want to assert that this is not empty. And the way that this would not be empty is when we call the connect method, we want to actually return this class, okay, which is going to be PDO connection. And for MySQLi, it's going to be MySQLi connection. All right, so let's trigger this test, which is obviously going to fail. So we're going to say vendor search bin /PHPUnit. You can actually create an alias for this. And then we want to be in the test folder. We want to test doc. And then also we want to use something new, which is called filter. So we want to filter the test because we don't want to actually run all our test cases. So we want to say database connection test. Okay, so this is the only test that we want to run now. All right, so we have a failure here. It can connect a database with PDO, error, class PDO connection not found, which is actually correct. So what we want to do now is to write code to actually fix this error. So let's get back again to the test editor, and then let's start by creating the contract. So let's come inside of our contracts folder, and we're going to add a new contract. So we're going to call this database connection interface. Then this is going to be in the namespace app contract, and it's going to be an interface. All right, so if you look at our UML diagram again, this is going to have two methods. One is going to be connect, and the other one is going to be get connection. Okay, so now we're done with the interface. We now want to create the abstract class. So let's come inside of our database folder. We want to create a class called abstract connection. So let's call this abstract connection. We can actually look at the UML diagram just to be consistent. Okay, so that's abstract connection. And then I'm going to actually make this an abstract class. In our abstract class, we're going to have two properties. They're going to be protected. So we're going to say protected connection. And the other one is going to be credentials. So, and then we're going to have one constant. And this constant is going to be required connection keys. I would explain what we need this for. So required connection keys. It's going to be equal to an empty array. So we're going to use this to specify the keys that we need inside of config for specific connection classes. So PDO, for example, you need to specify the driver that you want to use to connect, but for MySQLi, you don't need to specify the driver and some other parameters that we need to specify. So we're going to basically use this to specify the keys that we need when the credential is being passed into the class. And then we're going to have a constructor here. So we're going to say public function underscore underscore construct, and this is going to accept an array. So it's going to accept an array of credentials. So these are basically database connection credentials, and then we can map that to the credentials properties that we have in the class. And then the next thing that we would like to do now is to actually create the PDO connection class. So we're going to say right here, PDO connection. So that's in the namespace app database. And this is going to extend the abstract connection class. So we're going to extend the abstract connection. And then it's going to implement the connection interface. That will be database connection interface. Okay, so we need to actually provide those two methods, which is connect and get. And then for now, right here, we can just return. So we basically don't want to return anything from this method. We want to return the class itself. So we can say return this. And then we can actually specify the type that it expects, a PDO connection. And then now we can try to run our test again. Okay, so the test phase, because now we need to go back to the file and say that the PDO connection that we're actually talking about is the one that we just created. So what we need to do is to actually inject that. So app database PDO connection, add the use statement here. And when we run it again, we're going to get one more error, and then we'll fix that too. All right, now we get another error, undefined variable credentials. Okay, let's get back, and then let's say credentials is equal to an empty array. So then we can trigger the test again. Okay, so now everything works as expected. We can see it can connect to database with PDO, but actually we are not connecting yet to the database. But the whole point is that we want to get to green as fast as possible when writing our test cases. And then now we can take it to the next level. Are we passing in the right credentials and all of that? So let's get back again to the test editor. And then let's start by looking at the abstract connection class. You see here that we are basically passing in an empty array from our test, and everything basically works fine. Okay, so what we want to do is to ensure that we are actually passing in credentials here, valid credentials. So let's come to config database, and then we're going to create our database connection credentials. So I have basically have connection credentials for PDO that I wrote out. So to save time, I'm going to paste them here. So right here I have a key called PDO, and then I've specified my connection credentials that I actually want to use. So we want to call this database bug app. And then I have my passwords, which is empty string, and I also specify the default fetch type. Okay, so the different ways for us to fetch data when we query the database using PDO. So I want to set this to fetch object as the default. You can actually change it to whichever you want, and I think you should already be comfortable with the different fetch methods. So these are the credentials that we want, and these are the keys. Okay, so for PDO, these are going to be the required keys. So we want to go back inside of the class and then say these are the keys that we basically require. So I'm going to grab this, make things a bit easier. Let's come to PDO connection, and we want to basically override that constant. So the constant required keys should be equal to an array, and then we can basically paste what we copied. All right, so I've got to remove this, and then we want to remove this and just leave only the keys basically. So we only want the keys, we don't want the value. The values might not be correct. We're not interested in that right now. We're just interested that these keys are actually provided when you pass in the credentials. So we need to validate that. And as you saw previously, the test was passing even if we were basically passing in an empty array. We don't want this to happen. So we need to actually fix that. So let's come back again to our test. So we want to create a test, and the purpose of this test is to assert that if we basically don't pass in credentials to our connection, it's going to throw an exception. Okay, we can either rename this to be that test, or we can just duplicate it to write a separate one. Okay, so we're going to be changing a lot of this later. As we write more tests, we're going to refine the test cases that we have now to make it suitable to the application. So here we want to say it throws exceptions, it throws missing argument. So missing argument exception with wrong credential keys. Okay, so get to correct this. Test it throws missing argument exceptions with wrong credential keys. Right, so what we want to do is to basically say that this is going to expect an exception. So save expects an exception, and then we're going to say the exception that it should actually expect. So we have in our exception missing argument exception that we created previously. So we're going to say that we basically expect that when you attempt to connect to the database without all of the credentials that we need available for that connection method, or basically the keys that we require, then we're going to throw this exception. Okay, so we don't need to assert this. We just need to assert that it basically throws this exception. So let's attempt to run it again. It doesn't throw any exception, as you would expect. Okay, now we have a failing test. It throws missing argument exception with wrong credential keys. Okay, so it fails asserting that exception of type missing argument exception is thrown, which is actually correct because we are not doing any validation yet. So what we now need to do is to come inside of our abstract class. We want to do the validation in our abstract class because we want to use the same validation for any connection type that we're using. They only need to just define what are the required connection keys. So if it's a MySQLi connection, it only needs to define the required connection keys, and then we are basically going to validate using this class. Okay, so should we have named these credential keys? Okay, so maybe later we can think of a better name. So to validate, we need a different method here. So we're going to create a private method. So we're going to say private function credentials have required keys. Okay, and then we're going to basically pass it an array of the provided keys. So these are the keys that the user pass in to the connection method. So this will basically be an array of key value pairs. Okay, so and then we're going to expect this to return a boolean. So when you pass in an array to this method, we want to ensure that the keys that are inside of this array that you pass in are basically the ones that we require for that class. So let's name this properly. Let's just call this credentials, basically. Credentials. And then inside of here, we're going to create a variable called matches. This is going to be equal to array intercept. So in PHP, we have this function that allows us to basically compare two arrays and see if we actually have matching values. So array intercept will basically compare two arrays and return another array, which basically is going to contain the two identical values in both arrays. So if we have right here, we have an array. Let's just create a variable, say array 1. This is equal to, and then we can pass it a key. Say key. We basically just pass in some values. No need to be very strict here. And then let's call this 2. And right here, let's call this long and give this a different name. So if we use array intercept on these, it is going to return a new array with this value 2. Okay, so 2 and 2 is identical, so it's going to return a new array with the identical value. All right, so I'm going to get rid of this, and here we want to say sef required connection keys, and then the second one is going to be array keys. So let's use the PHP inbuilt function array keys, and then pass it the credentials. So remember that when we pass in the credentials, let's come back again here, it's going to be a key value pair arrays. Okay, so we have the keys here and then we have the values. So when we say right here array keys, we are saying just give us all of the keys as an array. So all of the keys inside of the credentials, we get them as an array, and then we're going to compare them against the value that are specified inside of required key connection. So if they have the same values, it's going to return all of the same values. Okay, all the values that are same inside of these two arrays will be returned as a new array, and that is what we're going to save here. So we're just going to now check if the elements that we have inside of matches. Okay, so we're going to say return the count of matches. So let's say it returns 2. We're going to check if that is equal to what we have inside of the count of the required connection keys. So that will be sef required connection key. So if our required connection keys is 5, we have 5 keys here, and then when we do array intercept, it doesn't have 5 that are the same, then it doesn't match. This should now result in the exception. Okay, so but if we have 5 and then it returns 5 from array intercept, so this should not be array key intercept, it should just be array intercept. So that's basically the way that we check that you're providing all of the required keys that we need to connect for that specific database type. And in our case, we are using PDO now, so that is going to basically mean that we are requiring about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 keys inside of that array, and they should actually have the same name like we have here. Okay, driver, host, db name, db username, db user password, and default fetch method. So right here we are now going to check. So we're going to say if not these credentials have required keys. Okay, so we can then pass in the, let's just pass in the credentials. Or we can say these credentials. So these credentials So if this is false, we want to throw an exception, which is basically what our test is expecting. So throw new missing argument exception, and then here we can now pass in a message. So let's just say database connection credentials are not mapped correctly. And then we can give an int here to say what are the things that we basically required. So required keys. And then basically we can do an implode on that. So that means that we need something like a sprintf here to make it look a bit better. So we could say sprintf, pass it a string, and then pass it a value. So the value we want to pass here will be an implode. So we want to implode the array with a comma. So basically we want to implode the required keys for that specific class. So we want to say comma and then say sef required connection keys. So let's run the test again. And it says it fails asserting that exception of type missing argument exception is thrown. So let's look at what might be wrong. So here we are throwing missing argument exception, self required connection keys. Okay, so let's open the test class. And here, let's say we are just instantiating. Okay, let's say we're instantiating with the credentials, and we try again. So we have 2 assertions and still 1 failure. So this basically means that our code is not working the way that it is expected to work. So let's get back again to the code and just look through to see where we may be doing something wrong. Okay, so here we're expecting missing argument exception. So let's come to the abstract class and then say here missing argument exception. Okay, so the same type that we are expecting, and we basically are passing in this message. So basically what's going on here is that there's a bug in our code that we need to fix. Okay, our test is expecting an exception if we don't pass in the required keys, but we don't actually get the exception. So if we basically come back here and just remove this, it should pass. So let's run the test again. You see, it passed, but it says that it is okay. But basically, because in the second test, we are not asserting anything, that is why we get this message here that the test is risky. Okay, but it doesn't complain of any errors. So this is to tell you that there is a bug in our code. And the bug basically has to do with late static binding. Remember that we have this abstract class here, abstract connection, and we have PDO. And then inside of the abstract class, we are saying safe. And when you say safe, basically what this does is it returns you the instance of the actual class. Okay, so but what we want to do is to ensure that we are using the keyword static. So when we say static, it is going to now use the correct class, which is basically the class that is implementing this class. Or if we are directly calling this class, it's going to be this class. Okay, but in this case, this class is abstract and we cannot directly new up an abstract class. So we need to say static so that whichever class is extending this class would be the class that is going to look for these required keys. And then we can try to run our test again. Okay, so now we get an exception. Missing argument exception, database connection credentials are not mapped correctly. And then it says, shows us the required keys. Okay, so this is not the behavior that we are expecting for the second one, but this tells us that everything is working fine, because if you see here, that the test which asserts that an exception is actually thrown passes correctly. So it says it throws missing argument exception with wrong credential key. So that test is passing correctly, but the next test is failing because it doesn't have the required connection credential keys. Okay, so we're going to fix that now.